Now, creating depth in your images is one of the best ways that you can enhance your landscape photography. In today's video, I want to cover a few different ways that you can create more depth in your landscape images in just a few simple clicks, either on the computer or in the field. I'm Austin James Jackson, professional landscape photographer based in Southern Utah. I'm so excited that you guys are here today. In this video, we'll be covering 4 different ways that you can create more depth in your landscape images. This is going to work for other kinds of images, but this is going to be specifically tailored towards landscape photography. Now, one of the most common ways to create depth in photography is via background blur or bokeh, which is something that a lot of photographers use. However, in landscape photography, oftentimes we want that front to back focus, so that background blur isn't available. So how can we distinguish our front of our scene, so our subject, or maybe it's our foreground, from our background? How can we create more depth there? Now, the first way that we can add more depth to our images, and this is going to be a post-processing trick, is by adding more contrast in the foreground than the background. Now, this might sound weird, but if you go outside, take a look around and look at something that's far away. Say there's some hills very far from you, and then there's something close to you. Whatever's close to you is going to have a lot more contrast than what's far away. You'll notice that if you look at mountains or hills in the distance that are really far, that they will be a little lower contrast. They'll be maybe a little brighter and a little hazier. And this is just because we're looking through more atmosphere. So we can recreate this effect on our photos or enhance this effect in order to create more depth. Let me show you how I do that. Now, we look at this photo first, and one thing that you will notice about this photo, you can see that this rock is in the background and it's lower contrast. This rock isn't a different color than any of these up close, but because we're looking through more atmosphere, especially in the ocean, there's a lot of atmosphere and a lot of mist and haze, you can see it's a lot lighter. So let's replicate that effect and let's add some contrast to the foreground. Now, sure, you could jump around with some of these contrast sliders, but we're going to use the masking tool here. I think that's going to be our best bet. First thing I want to do to add more contrast in the foreground is just use a linear gradient. On other photos, you may want to use another kind of selection, but on this one, we've got this equal foreground all the way across. We can just use this linear gradient. And I'm going to scroll down, and I'm just going to use our tone curve here to punch this up just a little bit. You can see how we can really add contrast quick by doing this. Let's just punch it up a little bit. And then let's go back up and we will punch our highlights and we might punch the whites. That's looking pretty good. Maybe we'll decrease the saturation because that comes up as we bring up the contrast. You'll see right there, we've added a lot of contrast into the foreground. Now I want to do the opposite to specifically the rocks. I don't care that much about the sky, but these rocks here, they are pretty close, but we can give this illusion of depth and create more distance between them by decreasing the contrast. Now for these rocks, I think the best way to do it is going to be to create a new mask. We're going to use luminance range, and then we're going to click on the rock. It's going to select everything that's really dark like that rock. We might even adjust this selection because we don't want that somewhere about in there. And then let's go ahead and just subtract, and we will subtract linear gradient just to get rid of that foreground. Just like that is pretty good to me. Now we can go down and sure, we could just lower the contrast slider here, but I want to actually show you a better way. Rather than just increasing the contrast, because when you have a selection like this, and we're just selecting the rock, if I bring up this contrast slider, it's just increasing the contrast of the rock, and there's not a lot of contrast already, so it's kind of struggles. Now instead, what you want to do is I would recommend raising the blacks maybe just a hair. And if you don't like the black slider, you can actually just go down and increase the blacks point on the curve. And you could even darken this if you want. You can brighten or darken, whatever looks better with your photo. I think I'm actually going to darken it, but we are going to bring that blacks point up. Now what that does by increasing that blacks point is it just kind of decreases the contrast. It decreases how dark it is. Now we can see when we toggle this mask before and after, before and after, before and after. It's not a lot, but it does a little bit to help create a little more depth in our image. Additionally, if we wanted to go up, and increase the exposure just a touch, we could, but don't get too carried away with this here. But that is essentially exactly what I mean when I say adding contrast to the foreground and taking it away from the background. I'll show you an example here. I've already built it out on this photo, so we're not going to be doing it, but I will show you, look how much more contrast is in my rocks here rather than over here. You can see right where the sunlight's hitting, that's creating some atmosphere. And there was a little bit less contrast up here, but I definitely enhanced that to help kind of show off that depth. Now, as an advanced technique, when you're doing something like this, you can also, and I did this a long time ago, I kind of did it pretty sloppy, but you can go in and paint out this hill right here to create depth between this hill and the one behind it. So always consider combining different masks in order to help create that extra contrast, or decrease that contrast rather, to help create more depth in your images. So let's talk about when you're out in the field, how you can help to create more depth in your images, because truly you can do a lot in post-processing, but you can't do it all. So you need to start with a good file. So what I would recommend is thinking about separation in your images. Think about how the objects, your subjects, the foreground, the background, how can you separate them from the background? And a lot of times, sure, this can be with light, but a lot of times that's going to be a lot easier to do this via color separation and or just contrast or brightness separation. And I don't mean a post-processing trick. I simply mean what is behind your subject. I'll show you this example here. This photo I shot at Bryce King in this past winter. Now we've got this really cool spire, and I stood in this particular spot exactly right here to get this rock right in the right spot. Now imagine if I had stepped maybe 15 feet to my left. What would be overlapping this rock would be this right here. There wouldn't be a lot of natural contrast there, and so there wouldn't be a lot of depth, because as far as anyone could tell, this rock is blended in with the background because they look so similar. Now, right now, you can tell this is a spire for two reasons. Number one, because it is catching a little bit of light. You can see the sunlight hitting here and then the shadow creating from the rock. And additionally, you can tell that it is its own separate little hoodoo because of the separation that I have in the background here. If there was no separation, even though it's slightly different color down here, everything would blend together, because when you zoom in on this image, if I was to just show you right here, especially over here, there's not a lot of natural separation there. And so you can't tell that there is any depth here. But when you create this nice background behind your subject in this scene, you can create a lot of natural separation, which creates a lot of depth. Now, back to post-processing, one thing I see a lot of people make the mistake of doing is they don't have good contrast in their image. And I don't mean that they don't have enough. Usually they have too much, and they've applied it with the contrast slider. I've made tons of videos on my page covering the tone curve and how I think it's great, but I want to kind of take a different angle on it here and talk about how you can create more depth via contrast in your image. So in my photography, I like to show off a really large range, a lot of tonality, meaning I like to have something that's really bright and I like to have something that's really dark. This is obviously easy to do when you've got a sunset or sunrise, but when you have something like a waterfall image, how can we increase the tonality in our image? I'll show you exactly what I mean. Now, I've got this image here shot in Yosemite, and a lot of people might just reef on this contrast slider, and then they'd say, oh, you know, the waterfall's getting a little blown out. We'll just drop that and maybe increase the shadows just a little bit and call that a day. Now, we're not going to do that. I'm going to show you a little bit better way to do it to help create more depth in my image. This composition also lends itself well to the depth because you can see this separation, and this uses a few other techniques that we've already talked about. But we'll use this tone curve to create contrast in our scene. Now, I always like to bring this black slider up. That's just going to help to lift those really dark blacks to bring back a little bit of detail to help me to add a little bit of depth in my image. And then we can go up, always do this first, then you can go up and adjust these sliders. Now, the other mistake a lot of people make on the other end of things is they'll say, well, if I shot my image properly exposed and I don't have any issues, I'm just going to raise the shadows and raise the blacks, because why wouldn't I want that detail? Drop the highlights, call it a day. A lot of people would think that looks good, but at the same time, it doesn't really look realistic and it doesn't show off depth. So you want to be really careful. Show off those details just a little bit, but not too much. And I know that's not a super helpful tip, because it's like, how do you know what's too much? And ultimately, you just have to kind of get an eye for it, but you will over time as you practice. My recommendation is to always make sure the darkest spots in your image are pretty dark, but you can still have just a touch of detail in there. One really key indicator for me is to look at this and say, are my darks distracting? No. Can I still tell what they are? Yes. So by leaving them dark, it kind of keeps the image not only honest, but it also keeps those darks from distracting from the subject of the scene here. Now I'll show you what I mean by that on this image here. So this is already kind of edited through. I'm really happy with the tonality in this image. You can see we've got some of our brighter areas over here, as well as on this cactus. Now we've got this dark area. A lot of people would make the mistake of just bringing these shadows and the blacks up too far to bring back all that detail, because we can. Now, all of this detail down here, there's some distracting stuff. I actually want to keep this dark because I can help mask out basically some of this shadow detail that is A, not important to the scene, and B, it distracts from the main subject. I might even bring the shadows down further. I don't want to go so far to where it's totally black, you can't tell what's under it. I just want to have a touch of detail so you can just see kind of what's going on, but it doesn't distract you from the rest of the scene. That is what I mean when I talk about kind of dialing in that contrast to help create depth in your image, but not distracting from the rest of the scene by bringing up those shadows too much. Really, trust me guys, get that full range of tonality if you can. You can see on this histogram as well, covers the full range, which is exactly what I'm looking for. Now we'll go back into shooting in the field. This was something that took me a long time to learn. For years, I chased great sunsets and great clouds. And yes, it's a great time to shoot at sunset or sunrise. It's great to capture those good clouds, but get there early. Not to scout, well, yes, to scout out your compositions, but not for that reason. Get there early for that great light. You're going to have good light before sunset or sunrise. I'll show you this image here was an image I shot in the winter. Used to be one of my favorites. I shot it in 2017, a long time ago, kind of back when I was just getting started in photography. And I like the edit, I like the sunrise and everything, but what it's lacking is light. It doesn't have any depth because it doesn't have good light. Now, it does help to have this tree here. That kind of creates a little bit of depth in the scene, but I needed light. If I could have just waited maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes until the sunlight was coming through and hitting my scene, even if I would have had worse clouds, I think I would have had a little bit better photo. Same mistake here. Got this great sunset, didn't capture the light. Would have loved to have captured the light on the rocks. That's going to help me to create an image, in my opinion, that has a lot more depth. You can see this image here, which is actually shot on the night before. This was shot on the next morning from the basically same spot. Look how much more depth this image has just because of this sunlight that's hitting right here and on the mountain. It just has so much more depth than the image on the right here because of that sunlight. Honestly, these conditions, this would be sunrise, was better than this sunset, but because of the light, it makes all the difference in the world when it comes to creating depth in my image. Now, the last thing here that I'll leave you with, something to kind of strive for, you can see this is an image I shot, pretty nice sunset. I was there a few minutes early. This was, you can see it is about 4 minutes difference between this and this. And you can see I have the light. The light looks so much better. Now, when I edit this all the way through, you have to decide, do you want clouds or do you want light? Once you really learn how to master the techniques, you can combine the two together. So you can see again, we have clouds, we have sunlight, and then I merge them together. And obviously I finished the edit here, but then you can get kind of the best of all worlds. This is really what you should be working towards when it comes to creating depth. You're going to have so much more depth if you can combine those great sunsets with that great light, in my opinion. So it makes a huge difference. Again, if I could only choose one, I would always take the light over the clouds because the light just creates so much depth. The shadow, the sunlight, there's so much depth in this image because of the light, especially all the shadows here. You can tell that this is like a nice little curve. The light just makes so much of a difference, guys. Trust me, chase the light. You will not regret it because it is going to create images that yield a lot more depth. Hopefully that'll help you guys to create more depth in your photography. If it did, make sure to let me know down below in the comments and subscribe to the channel, guys. I'm posting weekly YouTube videos that are covering all things landscape photography. I want to help you guys become better photographers. I want to help you avoid all the mistakes and pitfalls that I fell into so you guys can get on the fast track to taking a lot more compelling and better images. If you guys have any questions, as always, please feel free to let me know. Love hearing from you guys. And as always, I appreciate you watching so much. Thank you guys so much. This is Austin James Jackson, and we'll see you guys next time.